This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome to Indoor Air Quality Radio, IAQ Radio. It's Friday, March 15th, 2019. This week, I'm on the road, so we're going to do a Flashback Friday with the Mold Warrior, Dr. Ritchie Shoemaker, Part 2. Before we get started, we have to thank our sponsors.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com.
I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Particles Plus, Healthy Indoors Magazine, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, and AEML Inc. Laboratory. And of course, our association sponsors, the Indoor Air Quality Association and the Restoration Industry Association. Dr. Shoemaker, we have you on the line.
Well, good afternoon, Joe. It's nice to hear your voice.
Oh, it's great to have you back. We really appreciate you doing a double header for us here. It's a first on IAQ Radio, and you're certainly the best to have do it so far. We had a record on live listeners last week, and the downloads were second best ever, but this week we're planning on beating that. All right, last week we discussed innate immunity, how it is important, an important key to understanding how biological agents in water-damaged buildings affect human health. We learned about innate immune presentation, how it can be altered with subsequent inflammatory illness, and how it is also different from acquired immunity. Okay, so how are we doing so far?
You know, it's wonderful that you can put in just a few words what took me 10 or 15 minutes last week.
Well, it took me about an hour to figure it out. I had to go back and listen, like you recommended, go back and listen to the previous show, and it all made a hell of a lot of sense once I listened to it again, and you did a great job. All right, let's quickly review real quick innate immunity, why it's important, and then if you could, I'm looking at the biotoxin pathway. I've got it in front of me this week, and according to that pathway, some people are HLA susceptible and others are not. So we'll talk a little bit about innate immunity, recap that, and then if you can tell me what HLA is and why some people are susceptible and why others are not.
I'd like to use the concept of two separate divisions of immune response. The innate immunity is, for today's example, the left hand, and acquired or antibody formation is the right hand. Innate immune responses primarily are those that are the most evolutionarily conserved that we have, and interestingly, they're no different from what some of the most primitive single-cell organisms have. Whether you're a blue-green algae from 3 billion years ago, or whether you're Cliff Zlotnick, we have to deal with particular antigens being presented to us from the environment. And quite frankly, if we don't deal with these antigens quickly, we're not going to survive to reproduce, so that our babies can also worrying about antigens. Specifically, the mechanism of innate immune responses begins with what's called pattern recognition. And while the acquired or antibody system is enormously detailed, and very specific individual elements of antigens can be identified, the pattern recognition system is much grosser. And basically it looks at, again, evolutionary conservation of a variety of kinds of compounds that organisms from given types all have. If you want to recognize a Staphylococcus bacteria, it's nice to recognize a teichoic acid moiety. And there are receptors that will identify that and go into action if teichoic acid happens to show up. It is important to recognize beta-glucans, and we have receptors called dectin receptors, a couple different kinds of those, that will go into action if beta-glucans show up. Same thing with other sugar protein moieties. Glycoproteins is our word, especially mannose, or the kind of sugar that is used a lot by biological creatures. There's N-acetylglucosamine and acetylated compounds. And interestingly, many different biological creatures share use of these same kinds of compounds. So primitive organisms need to respond to a signaling element, even though the whole molecule may not be readily separable, say, from one kind of fungus to another. But if a fungus is among us, there should be a mechanism to recognize a pattern and then respond. Innate immune responses turn on the signaling devices then that bring out the body's initial phase of inflammation responses. Once we detect an antigen, here's a battle plan. Whether it's an inflammation protein called a cytokine or complement or maybe a factor that turns on a gene, they all are linked under this rubric of innate immunity. It's a quite complex system, and it's a system that's designed that once a signal is identified, an initial response follows, the responses to the response become multiplying. This ever-expanding, widening, multiplying exponential cascade helps the organism respond to this antigen rapidly and overwhelmingly. If that is a good event and the antigen is cleared, then everybody is happy and the innate immune system goes home for the night. If the antigen is not cleared, the innate immune hyper-response becomes the illness.
Okay, let's one thing. What is HLA?
In antigen recognition, we have immune response genes, and there's a couple different kinds. The histocompatibility locus A or human leukocyte antigen HLA are genes found on chromosome 6, and there are 54 of these different gene structures that we've identified in people of all races. And it's interesting that there's no difference among races, or between races, I should say, regarding HLA. But specifically, the antigen identification is under control of HLA. And if there's a problem with antigen recognition due to HLA, that same problem I mentioned to you of the innate immune response becoming the enemy will occur. It's like there's a giant hole in the dragon's scales, if you will. And if you're a little dwarf and you shoot an arrow through that hole, you'll take down the dragon. And that's kind of what happens in people with exposure to water-damaged buildings. Not everyone has that hole in the armor, the hole in the scales. If you do, however, you're going to get hit.
Well, the reason I asked that is we have a question from a listener, and what the question is can a HLA marker identify the type of chemical, biologic, and or allergenic stressor?
Actually, no. HLA is a marker. It by itself does not diagnose a disease. And we use the concept from epidemiology called relative risk to help us with susceptibility. And specifically, what that means is if we look at how many people in our case group, or the incidence in the case group, have a given HLA, we can give a number to that, and we divide it by how many people in our control group have that same HLA. So incidence in cases over incidence of controls gives a number. If that number approaches 2.0 and exceeds it, we then start talking about increased susceptibility. HLA doesn't tell you that there's a mold there. It just says that this is what the person has as a potential mechanism of identifying or not presence of antigen responsiveness. It is important to remember that there is outstanding research now going on that looks at the structure of these genes such that their particular amino acid sequence will tell us how an antigen really is recognized and why there may or may not be an effective response of the organism based on HLA to that antigen.
So someday we may be able to answer that question?
Researchers are making spectacular advances, especially in some of the very unusual HLAs that I worry most about. In my jargon is 4.3.53 and 11.3.52b. Those two particular ones are associated with a much worse prognosis if we see them. But we're also now looking at how it is that many inflammatory processes overlap that share these particular HLA haplotypes.
Okay, let me try and go a step further now. We've got this biotoxin or toxin-producing organism. You've got HLA susceptible or HLA biotoxin not HLA susceptible. Those are the ones that people can remove from the body. They do pretty well. Some hit a nerve cell and there's I guess an immediate reaction. Then on the chart I see there's a surface toll receptor to a fat cell, and then that goes down to the hypothalamus, and you then have this section on reduced MSH, and there's a whole bunch of different, I guess, reactions as the result of that reduced MSH. Can you tell us what MSH is and why it is so important to this biotoxin pathway?
Sure. What I want you to know is that the link from, say, toll receptors, and the chart doesn't show dectins and mannose receptors, but it is the link of cytokine release following gene transcription initiated by docking, so to speak, of the foreign antigen, which can include a toxin, to a particular receptor. But the cytokine, once released, becomes the illness. The antigen sets off the problem. The cytokines are the warriors. Cytokine rise can attack the functionality of a receptor in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. This is a real regulatory center where a number of very important hormones are made, and they all talk to each other. If you think in military terms, this is command and control of our immune responses. But if the pathway is damaged by cytokine response, and leptin we talked about last week is the marker there. If leptin can't do its job and turn on production of MSH deficiency invariably follows. Now, most people that I see who've been sick for more than 6 months, once their MSH starts to fall through this inflammation pathway, don't have full recovery of MSH. Loss of MSH control of inflammation is a real serious clinical problem, because now MSH is like the graphite rod or the dampening mechanism that shuts down inflammatory responses like crazy once they get started. With MSH, you control fever and reactions in skin and mucous membranes, the respiratory tract and GI tract, as well as in blood. And MSH interacts with a large number of other compounds. Without MSH being present adequately, fatigue is essentially going to be there. Chronic non-restorative, non-restful sleep is highly associated with MSH deficiency. Chronic pain can also result, because remember, when MSH is made, at the same time a parent molecule is split to release MSH, out comes beta endorphin. And without beta endorphin, you don't regulate pain responses. You know, if you look at your fibromyalgia patients where people got chronic diffuse pain and they really react to minor stimuli, it's not the stimulus makes them hurt. The stimulus is in a person with low MSH, and they don't downregulate in the brain the neural response to whatever initiated that quote, painful response, end quote. So chronic pain syndromes are quite common in MSH deficiency. MSH is richly endowed in the gut, and many kinds of problems in GI physiology are controlled by MSH themselves. We talked briefly about autoimmunity last week in the gut, and presence of gliadin antibodies is a real problem in children with mold illness, and certainly adults to a lesser extent, but far more in the mold patients compared to the non-mold patients. MSH is the big player right here. Now, that's not celiac disease. Don't forget that. MSH also controls mucous membranes to keep out some very unusual and rare organisms that can make what's called biofilms to hurt us. They live in the nose and can cause an awful lot of damage. These unusual multiply antibiotic-resistant organisms can hurt us. So MSH deficiency plays a big role there. Finally, MSH controls pituitary processes for hormone regulation themselves. So we think about adrenal function, and that's controlled by ACTH, but MSH has a big role in controlling that. And abnormalities in ACTH and cortisol are found in about 40% of mold illness patients. The most common hormone abnormality we see has to do with antidiuretic hormone relationship to salt in the blood, or osmolality. And when you find a mold patient who has frequent thirst and frequent urination, and sometimes, strangely, Joe, they get these really weird electric shocks, static shocks all the time, be thinking of ADH problems due to MSH. Funny headaches that act like migraine, be thinking about ADH deficiency and dehydration. A lot of your patients will come in and they'll tell you they get weak, woozy, or wobbly when they stand up. They go to the cardiologist, get a tilt table test done, and they're diagnosed with some strange, neurally mediated hypotension. It's usually just intravascular volume depletion due to ADH problems, which is due to MSH. Why do I focus on MSH? Because I know full well, without control of MSH, all the elements, while each one may not be present, all of them can contribute to a progressive chronic illness in the patients that I see. By correcting each one of those individually, we can compensate for MSH deficiency, but because we don't have MSH available to give to you, we can't fix it definitively yet.
Okay. And one more time, what MSH, the acronym MSH stands for?
Melanocyte stimulating hormone. The melanocyte, or melanin produced in the cell in the skin, was where this was first found. It certainly has a lot to do with other mechanisms, weight control as well.
Is this easy to measure?
Yeah, all you need to do is draw a blood test. We use a chilled tube. We draw a plasma sample or a lavender tube, and as soon as we draw it, we'll take it to the lab and spin down the lavender tube in the chilled centrifuge we use to make sure that we don't get a false reading by having warm tubes. We don't let it sit up on the counter. And as soon as it comes out of the blood, you've got to add a protective compound called a proteinin that prevents an enzyme from destroying MSH. These proteinases are ones that are blocked by a proteinin, so that when you draw MSH, put in your 0.5 or 0.25 cc's, depends on which lab you use, a proteinin, and then spin it down right away. Then you can freeze it and send it off anytime you want.
Okay, and I assume that's a really good thing with respect to your research. You're able to, actually measure this pretty easily, and it sounds like fairly inexpensively.
Insurance companies have routinely covered that. We use the LabCorp assay. It's been the most reliable. LabCorp has been playing some funny games with normal ranges about MSH. The actual normal range is 35 to 81 micrograms per mil. LabCorp changed that in September of 2006. They were getting swamped with people using my protocol. They had so many low MSHs, they decided low MSH was normal. They combined levels of cases and controls. That's crazy. You can't do that.
Oh my. All right, let's move on a little to treatment, because we didn't get to that last week, and I know you and I talked about not getting to that. I played around a little bit last night, went on to the chronicneurotoxin.com website, and I did the questionnaire. So I guess the first thing that you do is you have people do the questionnaire, and it's a fairly lengthy questionnaire about your possible exposure to any number of biotoxins, I guess, and other medical questions. Then there's the is it the visual acuity test, VCT?
It's called visual contrast.
Visual contrast test. Okay.
Visual acuity is completely different.
Okay. All right. Visual contrast test. And I did that. Now, you've got people that have gone through that, and you get a yes on both, that they have a possible problem that needs followed up on. Take me down the road, if you could, kind of quickly from there. How do you handle it from there?
When a new patient comes in, hopefully they've looked either at chronicneurotoxins.com or biotoxin.info or even moldwarriors.com to get an idea of what our diagnostic process is. We're going to want to look to see that there are multiple symptoms from multiple body systems. You have to have multiple symptoms. You can't just say, I've got a cough and a cold, therefore I'm sick from the mold. That's not enough. You need to have evidence that there is a significant potential for exposure. And some of the questions that you answered, Joe, were primarily, have you been in a building where there's water intrusion and visible mold or musty smells? Have you been bitten by a tick and told you had Lyme disease? Have you been in a freshwater lake in Florida and dodged the alligators to suck up some blue-green algae toxin? The real issue is that if we think about these illnesses of innate immunity, which are all set off by the same mechanism, the symptoms in the labs are pretty much the same. So your exposure becomes critical. You can't say you've got Lyme disease if you don't have a tick bite somewhere along the way, and you can't have a blue-green algae illness if you haven't been around a lake with blooms of blue-green algae. Similarly, you can't have a mold illness if you're not exposed to the interior environment of a water-damaged building. Now, I'm going to put a little star on that last statement because I bet we'll get a question or two. I know if I practice medicine long enough, I will see someone that I can prove was made ill by exposure to molds and compounds growing with molds in an outdoor environment, compost pits or leaf piles. The fact that I haven't seen it yet and I've looked for it since 1998 doesn't mean I won't find one tomorrow. But believe me, I really do feel that today it's about 5,000 to none as far as my cases indoors versus cases outdoors. I feel pretty strongly that the potential for exposure is an indoor environment. If you have symptoms and potential for exposure, what we've got to do now is prove that you don't have exposure to something else. And the fancy way of saying this is differential diagnosis. If you've got diabetes that's way out of control, or active liver disease, or if you have an undiagnosed and untreated neurologic condition, you can't blame an illness on exposure to water-damaged building alone. You've got to recognize that we're dealing with people here, and people can have more than one thing. Now, having said that, being exposed to water-damaged building does not give you diabetes out of control more often, does not give you hypertension more often, does not give you heart disease more often, does not give you any of these illnesses that are, quote, confounders. So we need to be very careful to look at each entity one by one. And that's where sorting what you have in and sorting what you don't have out comes in.
Okay. Now, once you've teased all these things in and out, is there just one standard treatment protocol, or are there several?
What we do next, we're still, kind of playing around of have we diagnosed the case. What we then do is ask for a visual contrast test done in person. The tests online are good, but I really feel that you have to have it done, by someone who's got experience in giving these tests one-on-one to make sure we're not looking at a computer variable or a contrast problem based on an internet connection, and these things happen.
Okay.
And so the visual contrast test is next. Then we do the labs, and as this case definition comes out, you've got to have 6 elements to question of whether or not they're present. A minimum of 3 is necessary for me to say you're a case.
Okay.
And after we've got this first tier of exposure and symptoms and lack of confounders, then you've got to have either visual contrast deficit, an MSH deficiency, and HLA susceptibility, and abnormalities of ADH and osmolality, and ACTH and cortisol. We talked briefly about those. But then the last one is elevation of a cytokine marker called MMP9. You don't have to have all 6 of these, but you need to have 3. Now, if you've got those, the first step is to request removal from exposure, and if the patient can tolerate taking cholestyramine, to initiate cholestyramine, taking on an empty stomach. And by the way, we've got some toxicology questions where they didn't use an empty stomach. We'll get to those in a minute.
Okay.
But specifically on an empty stomach, you take this drug 4 times a day. You've got to wait at least 30 minutes after you take this glue, which is what it is. It'll get washed through your stomach if you have some extra glass of water or juice, or even Gatorade would be fine. Doesn't really make too much difference. But you wash it through the stomach and get it into the first part of the duodenum. There you've got a structure, which is a big opening for tubes that come from the pancreas as well as then from the liver. And the liver tube, the bile duct, is what we're after, because the mechanism to date that everybody who's done research and published on this talks about these biotoxins being inhaled or eaten in the rare cases. I don't think that has anything to do with mold illness, by the way, but getting into the body, being transported through blood or by cell to cell. I talked to you about it, what an ionophore was. It basically is this Casper the Ghost thing that moves from cell to cell. But these compounds eventually end up in cells that line bile ducts. And those cells, curiously, have mechanisms to take these little compounds that can't be metabolized and can't be destroyed, and they dump them into bile. Bile is like the big sewer of the liver, and the sewer empties into the duodenum. And these little compounds, if there's no cholestyramine waiting to grab them, will be reabsorbed and they circulate on going through. If cholestyramine is there, the structure of cholestyramine with this net positive charge on the side chain, this quaternium ammonium compound, about 1.43 angstroms in diameter, will lock into a shared electron ring of these ionophore toxins that has an ionic radius of about 1.41 angstroms. And that's not my work, that's just what I read about and other people have published on. And essentially it's an electrostatic interaction between toxin and cholestyramine that essentially puts a big old bulky anchor on this toxin so it no longer can be reabsorbed as it normally would further down in the small intestine. So this circulation from liver to intestine and back into the body is disrupted by cholestyramine, and the person can have a bowel movement and out it goes.
Okay. And I think you
That's the first phase of treatment.
All right. Okay. And I think you anticipated two things. Let me just real quick interject. One was, and I want to get a couple questions while we're at it. How does the cholestyramine work to bind to the toxins? That's essentially what you just explained. Am I correct there?
Yeah, I think it's your questions that I had a chance to look at were really excellent, and I'm not surprised, from what I've been reading on about you, and you did about me. You guys are really, really number one, top of the list. And the real issue is that I had 2 freezers full of people's bowel movements. And one lawyer said I must be fun at cocktail parties. I had saved this stool in these 2 freezers of people treated with cholestyramine because I desperately wanted to have an assay that will show before treatment we didn't find any toxin in stool, and that after treatment with cholestyramine we did find it. I did kind of get a little bit of criticism for using freezers that way, so that was disposed of in proper medical hazardous waste situation. But because we didn't have an assay for toxin bound to cholestyramine that was available commercially, maybe we will someday, but the final proof of this whole mechanism would be to show bound toxin in stool. Haven't gotten there yet, don't have the commercial assay yet. So we've got to rely on literature that other people have published together with clinical changes to help us understand what goes on.
Well, great. That answers another question that was brought up. So before we go to a short break here, I have one more. There was a question about the potential risk versus benefit of using cholestyramine, and the fact that, as I've been taught by Dr. Weil, the dose makes the poison. Just about anything can be a poison. Can you comment on the risk versus the benefits of using cholestyramine?
Well, here we need to have a little fun with Dr. Weil, because in this case, the dose initiates the poison cascade. The dose is not the poison. But in terms of cholestyramine, what we look at is the fact that these patients that I see, remember, we're not talking about irritation, we're not talking about infection, we're not talking about allergy, we're talking about an inflammatory illness, a systemic inflammatory illness. These people will not self-heal without doing something. And believe me, I have tried about everything in the world to substitute for cholestyramine, because at least 5% of my patients will not want to continue because it can constipate you. It is a gut grenade 4 times a day to mix up this horrible yellow powder on an empty stomach. Who's got time for that? And more important, it's going to give you reflux and bloating and belching. But after about a week or so, you start seeing an illness that you've had for 2 years start to clear and your brain starts working a little bit better, it suddenly is really good Ucky yellow stuff to take. So the risk benefit is that the benefit is zero without it, and with it, there's 92% of my patients now, still 92% have a 75% reduction of symptoms. We've got now a couple-year follow-up on a very large number, and at 5-year follow-up, we're looking at about 60 to 75% reduction of symptoms being persistent in patients we've treated. And that's not something we see all the time.
All right. So now you mentioned Dr. Wow. We've unmuted him for a moment. Then I just want to give all the listeners a little, give the listeners a little heads up. We may run over again this week a little, if that's okay with you, Dr. Shoemaker. We've got a great list of people and questions. I want to bring Dr. Wow in. Then we're going to go to Glenn Fellman. We're going to do a real quick IE Connections, What's News. And first, I wanted to give Dr. Wow a chance if he had a quick question or comment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You see that in pharmacology, when that dose response curve, when you are first experiencing a good effect, and in other words, you don't get a straight line dose response curve. You're on the left side of it. But then again, if you were to increase the dose, well, then you get to the other side of the dose response curve. And sure enough, now you can, depending on the dose, find a multitude of reactions. Most of them are bad for you. And certainly there is a dose that I can find that will kill somebody. But we are not talking about that part of the dose response at all. We are talking about the beneficial effect of a drug. And that indeed does happen, yes.
Iaqradio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Gold sponsors are Particles Plus engineers and manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at AEMLinc.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at IAQA.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry. Network with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org.
Okay, I've got a bunch of listener questions here, and what I'd like to do real quick is I gave you some of these questions in advance. Is there one or two in particular that you really think we should address up front?
Well, I think the issue has to do with the research basis of approach to this illness. And you had a couple questions about controls and a couple questions about studies. Until there were treatment protocols available, and cholestyramine is just the first. Each of the different elements that are shown to be potentially abnormal in the biotoxin pathway do require treatment because all of these have got to be addressed to restore health. But once health has been restored, even if a person may have persistent problem with MSH, we now are able to look at these patients prospectively. And that means that instead of I saw a building with 26 people in it and 30 that were not sick. Now we can take those 26 people and make them into not sick and then take them right back to what a control should be for symptoms and baseline and visual contrast. And they become the target element here. They become their own controls, and the variable we look at is time. And time of exposure can eliminate a huge amount of other potential confounders. So if someone is sick, say from a water damaged building, and we treat them and they become feeling pretty good, we can stop their drug, whatever they're taking, and they should be able to move around anywhere in their environment and not become ill until they come to a building that's water damaged. Now, if the water damaged building is going to make them ill, we then use that same person now as their own control, and they're re-exposed. That really controls for so many different variables of patients, whether you're tall or sort of short or skinny or overweight or 50 or 30. You eliminate gender is also controlled, race is controlled, predisposing conditions are controlled, and everything is all the same. Then we can look at this one model prospectively, and that gives us the epidemiologic term risk. And that prospective approach is what we call the sine qua non. This is how you show causation. In all the arguments about mold illness that I've seen, it is the prospective reacquisition of illness with informed consent that gives you cause. It doesn't tell you what in the building that made you sick. It just says that something in the building made you sick. We would like to be able to have you guys come in and tell us what is in the building so we can then sort out individually what it is that makes people sick. I think we're going to find it's many different things make people sick. But looking at these questions as a whole, causation theories and Bradford Hill suggestions. By the way, Bradford Hill never talked about criteria. He specifically uses 7 different terms and never uses the word criteria, just to have a little fun.
Okay.
But specifically, the time interval controls are critically important. Secondly, beyond using the case approach versus control approach and then a prospective approach, we also have the double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And in this double-blinded trial, we really are taking this developing body of literature to the next level. Because if you can't show a double-blinded trial with benefit, I don't think you convince anybody. Kundi, you mentioned, is one of the papers looking at causation theory, looks at a commonality of findings through the whole body of epidemiology. And that's what our studies are showing. So Kundi is very much one of my favorite guys these days. But the real issue that I see coming around to is that the blood tests that people have done, the symptom databases, the visual contrast databases, they all teach us using statistical methods of what should we be looking at in people who are well before they go into buildings, or if they work in moldy buildings and feel fine, go ahead and obtain some baseline parameters such that if you do get sick, you ought to be able to say, well, did my MMP9 or my C4A change? Because if it didn't change, it probably wasn't the building that did it.
Okay, that's a perfect lead into a question from a listener, and Cliff will ask it.
Right. Dr. Shoemaker, what do water damaged schools do to the health of our children? How prevalent do you think the problem is? And while you're at it, do you have any comment on something called the ACOEM mold statement?
Well, I've been very concerned about schools for years. I don't know about your county, but most of our county budget goes to public education. We look at the enormous cost of a building. Around here, they use flat roof construction a lot. We have enough weather coming in off the Atlantic Ocean that it's not unusual that these flat roof buildings will develop a leak. And then the question comes, what's it cost to do preventive maintenance on the buildings, and what's it cost to keep them up before the leak arises? Our school district is pretty strapped for cash, and we see a less amount of money spent on maintenance compared to, say, a school district that might be better off. And remember, we've got Ocean City in our county, which is a huge generator of money in Maryland. So we're better off than most. Imagine a poor school district that didn't have the money even for the band teacher, the music teacher. So maintenance is a giant issue. Schools have a much greater incidence of young people compared to non-schools. And it sounds silly to talk about that, but in our pediatric mold illness population, we find a far greater incidence of these unusual autoimmune phenomenon appearing gliadin antibodies and cardiolipin antibodies and weird-looking arthritis. We see so many children diagnosed with attention deficit and behavioral abnormalities and learning disability when they're just moldy. Even worse is the school teacher who's got 25 kids in a classroom that should hold 17. She's having to bring things from home and pay for things on her own because the school district doesn't have money for her. And she's got her own family and husband to take care of, and she's taking work home, and she's stressed and pushed like crazy, and she starts getting tired, not knowing there might be a potential microbial problem in the school. Who's going to blame it on the school first off? By the time she sees maybe that there's now a leak and there's buckets in the front hallway and a wet carpet that smells real funny, who do you get to take care of it? The school teacher as an individual is powerless. We have some unions of school teachers, quite frankly, that are not proactive helping the individual teachers. And the teacher says, well, I'm mad. This building made me sick, and I can prove it's the building. Then they say, I'm going to sue you. Well, who do you sue? Workman's comp is about all there is.
Right.
So some of the legal things the school teacher has are really reduced. So lots of young brains being hurt, lots of young bodies getting hurt more easily than adult bodies is a real problem. Demands made on teachers, I think, are really inappropriate. And then who defends the teachers? Because the investment in a teacher is pretty substantial. So are school problems, school water issue problems, a big deal? Yes. Is it 25% of the schools? I saw that number from OSHA. I have no idea how much it is. But in the end, Joe, when you and I are turning up daisies in the grave, it is our children that are the markers of how well we did as parents and how well we did as a society. And if we start raising moldy kids, golly, you know, what's going to happen? Heck, they'll probably be putting tattoos on themselves next.
All right, I've got another one. Now, I want to add to this one. It was a question that was texted in. Regardless of the details and the precise logic, the confounders, and other criticisms of any new endeavor, what accounts for the improvement with cholestyramine and similar when other treatments fail? And I want to add something to that. Would cholestyramine assist someone who had, let's say they had too much medication in them as opposed to a biotoxin, or too much of some other kind of chemical toxin in their system? Is it helpful for them as well?
Cholestyramine has been recommended for use for a huge number of chemical poisonings. You know, it's the only poisoning we have for dioxin, for example, only antidote for dioxin poisoning. You know, that poor guy out in Ukraine with all the pockmarks on his face and near death. Too bad he didn't call me. We could have fixed him pretty quick. PCBs, DDTs, DDEs, any number of toxins or toxic chemicals are bound to cholestyramine. I called it glue. I really do mean that. You can't take it with food. Bad things will follow that. You just won't be absorbed. It is a situation that, how do we look at improvement when you give cholestyramine to somebody? It will never be absorbed. It doesn't add anything to you. It only removes something. And if you're better after cholestyramine, it is safe to conclude by the basis of mechanism of this drug's effect that you pulled something out, or something that was dumped into the intestine no longer is there to hurt you. The best demonstration of this works has to do with the toxicity of one of the anti-inflammatory drugs for rheumatoid arthritis called Arava. It's not used too much anymore because it did have a lot of toxicity, but the breakdown product of Arava was called the M protein, which just lasted forever in the body. And wonderful studies done with cholestyramine show that it bound to the M protein rapidly. It blocked enterohepatic recirculation, and this prolonged forever and ever half-life of the M protein essentially is truncated like crazy once you start with cholestyramine. Cholestyramine is just the first step of treatment. It's certainly not the last step.
Okay, good. And that's something I wanted to get into maybe in a moment here, but let me ask another question that was texted in here. There's a question about chemical sensitivities versus biotoxin illness. And I'm going to tie that in with another question that or comment. At some point, you and Dr. Claudia Miller were talking about how to collaborate. Now, she works with multiple chemical sensitivities, so I guess those two questions kind of tie together. Can you comment on chemical sensitivities and biotoxin or mold illness, and are you doing any work with Dr. Miller?
Well, it would be an honor if I were to work with Dr. Miller. She is kind of the queen bee, if you'll be permitting me to let me use that term. She's been doing this for a number of years and has a database much larger than I have. I only have about 500 patients who have significant chemical sensitivity, and some have severe chemical sensitivity to the point that they pretty much live in a bubble and eat 3 or 4 foods, and that's about it. Some aren't quite that bad. But every one of my patients with chemical sensitivity that I've seen to date has had an initiating event being exposure to a water damaged environment. Now, I'm not saying that the only source of illness that ends up with chemical sensitivity is exposure to water damaged building. That's just all I've seen. And believe me, I've seen a number of people who thought formaldehyde was their problem or something else and something else. When you start going back through the history, understanding that's kind of looking through the curtains and mists of time of what can we really find, the potential for exposure really is there. The unifying factor in mold illness patients and in chemical sensitivity patients, to me, is very promising, and that is low levels of another neuroregulatory hormone called VIP, or vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. The work that Dr. Petska and his group has done, boy, they've done great work over the years at Michigan State. In the study I'm thinking about, they looked at direct neurotoxicity of stachytoxins to olfactory neurons, or nose neurons, basically, and how this developed in an animal model. We see the same kind of thing because the olfactory neurons will first migrate in part to the brain in the hypothalamus, where there's a large nucleus where these neurons are kind of collated and summating their experiences, so to speak. And the neurotransmitter there is vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. And the hypothesis is, was there inhalation exposure, olfactory nerve injury led to subsequent hypothalamic neuron or nucleus injury that related to a loss of VIP. Now, we also have inputs from retina into this same nucleus. So it's possible that exposure across the retina and through the nose are contributing to some of the problems that people have with mold illness. Chemical sensitivity often will involve visual disturbances as well. So it's an interesting hypothesis. We are going to be applying to the FDA next week for an IND to use replacement VIP in some of our severely ill patients, and we're hoping to eventually extend that to MCS patients, because I honestly feel that we can use this A, safely, B, effectively, and gosh, what a tremendous improvement it would be to the quality of life for an MCS person to actually be able to walk into a supermarket without getting sick.
Okay, great. Now, I've got a couple other ones I'd like to try, and I've got about 4 real quick. I hope we can kind of go, yes and no, or it's too tough of a question to answer that quickly. Go to this reference for more information if we can do that. Okay. All right. One is, in your book, Mold Warriors, there was a reference to forthcoming data on acute mold exposure and subsequent rapid rise in C3A. Is that data now published?
Yes, we presented that at your IAQA meeting in October in Las Vegas, looking at C3A and C4A. As far as being peer-reviewed, that's in the works. What we did first was to publish a paper in January of 2008 on C3A and C4A in acute Lyme disease. And we're looking at the mechanisms of C3A rise as being vital in the innate immune responses.
Okay, next one, Cliff.
Do you have any suggestions for the patient who gives this primary doctor the biotoxin lab order sheet? The doctor, who may know very little about biotoxin illness, just dismisses the need for the lab work and seems to think that the patient is just overly stressed.
Yeah, I hear that too often. I honestly feel the doctor-patient relationship should be based on respect and trust. when someone comes to me with information that I don't know anything about, my response is not, you're an idiot, don't bother my time. My response is, gee, I don't know that, let me look. I don't have a lot of respect for physicians who know so much they dismiss something that is well represented in peer-reviewed literature out of hand. That's not how we should be doing primary care medicine in the United States.
Okay, and how do they? What do they do then? Go to someone else, I guess, is the best answer.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right.
You know, the way the world is that, you know, if a doctor doesn't see a patient, he doesn't get paid.
Okay.
And if he continues to treat patients with disrespect, then he should not get paid. There will be somebody else.
All right. I want to go to a text question that came in early today, and we want to get that to Cliff.
Doctor, the question is, if you can, for prospective patients, please ask what is the criteria for treatment with EPO. I'd like to know if you could define EPO, if you know what it is, and for a prospective patient, define what the criteria would be for treatment.
And maybe we could give them a reference to go to, because I'm sure that would take a while to actually discuss.
Let me try to hit it in 3 sentences.
Okay.
Specifically, I've talked to you about C4A being this complement activation product that changes all kinds of things in blood flow and inflammation throughout the body. Lowering C4A in some people with the worst gene representation is usually extremely difficult. EPO or Procrit does that and can do it safely. EPO is a drug that's not FDA approved for treatment of high C4A. We've presented 2 papers, one to the CDC-sponsored chronic fatigue group in January of 07 and one in November of 07 on mold patients. Each of these were IRB-approved studies where we safely used EPO in people who had brain abnormalities, and we talked about what those last week, and high C4A where nothing else had worked. I would never recommend anybody thinking about using EPO until they've exhausted all elements of treatment before they get there. Once they get to the point where EPO is required, then it is an experimental protocol that must be followed. Exactly. It does work. It's not FDA approved.
Okay. I recall, and this is a question that was emailed to us. I recall in Mold Warriors, you opine that CFS is a biotoxin, or in biotoxin patients, is the result of muscle tissue being forced into the anaerobic cycle due to immune complexes clogging capillaries, thus having less ATP production. Martin Paul describes in several publications his opinion that CFS is the result of damage due to mitochondria due to peroxynitrate. Since peroxynitrate is also produced in biotoxin patients due to inflammation, do you think this mechanism also plays a role with biotoxin patients?
I've worked in the chronic fatigue arena for a number of years. In 2004, Marty Paul and I talked about a research model for investigating his thoughts about reactive oxygen species in chronic fatigue and other kinds of illnesses. We look at the conversion of citrulline to arginine following exposure to a precipitating event. As Marty said, would show us the response. It didn't. I had the pleasure to sit beside Marty for 4 days in August of 07, talking about chronic fatigue, and we went back and forth. Marty is a wonderful guy. He's a very smart PhD. He's not a physician. He has never treated his first patient. We are part of a group that's looking at his model together with some others, looking at where does chronic fatigue come from. In chronic fatigue, you will find a gigantic segment of patients who have a biotoxin illness with capillary hypoperfusion, the mechanism. Is there contribution of reactive oxygen species? I'm sure there is, having seen patients improve in the vast majority of times with ignoring reactive oxygen species. I'm not so sure that takes primacy here. But my opinion of his illness paradigm is that he's a real smart guy, and we really need to pay attention to what smart people say. Let's test what he says, and when he comes up with another model, let's look at it. But we've got to have an animal model and a research model that makes sense before we get IRB approval to test it.
Okay, I got another quick one here. What is the best? No, that's not the one I wanted. Here, is there any lab work available to test the blood for mycotoxins and mycobacteria?
Bruce Ferguson from Envirologics in Portland, Maine, I think has really brought this question along a lot further. He had a nice assay for saprotoxin and roradin. I worked with him for a while, 5-6 years ago, and we showed pretty good results in our initial phase. He then started working with Dr. Brazel and then Dr. Strauss and Dr. Dearborn, each one of whom has published a paper using envirologic assays showing the ability to detect saprotoxin and roradin in cases where people are exposed to buildings with stachy, not found in patients not exposed to water damaged buildings or to known stachy. So yes, there is a research assay available. Yes, it's been validated. No, it's not available commercially. I don't know of any commercial assay available for mycobacteria. The work we're doing with mycolactones, which is one of the mycobacteria toxins that quite frankly scares the hell out of me, is done with a PCR assay. That's again an experimental approach. We're just seeing these new creatures literally coming out of the mud, and it's frightening to me that we never had those, say, in the Chesapeake Bay that we knew of forming mycolactones until a couple of years ago. And the pattern of illness I get to see in environmental illness is changing rapidly. The analogy to that has to do with equatorial Africa and South America, where a particular mycobacteria called invadans is causing Buruli ulcer to cause a lot of disability. Interestingly, topical cholestyramine works beautifully on that ulcer. So maybe we'll see a change as time goes by.
Okay.
Cliff? Another question from a listener. If a person limits their exposure to a chronic water damaged area of a building to only an hour or two per day, 5 days a week, can their body completely heal without the need for medication?
Well, boy, there's so many paragraphs to go through to answer that question. Number one, this is not a dose-response situation, so it's not a matter of an hour or 30 minutes or 10 hours or something else. It is a matter of what is the status of innate immunity in this person. For someone who has been sick from a water damaged building because of genetic susceptibility and prior illness with low MSH, if they go into a water damaged building for 20 minutes, we can show a physiologic change in blood with testing a couple hours later. So in that person, 20 minutes is too long. For those who've not been made ill, who have no genetic susceptibility, they can work and play in the moldy buildings all they want. And while some, rare some, will have an illness, it is much easily treated if it does occur, but most people, about 75%, will not develop an illness. So in order to answer that question, we need to know a few other things. Who are we talking about? What is their prior exposure? But if they've been sick before, this is a critical issue. They need to know what the monitoring and what the measurements of compounds in an environment is before they go walking in there. There was a question about how do you measure mycotoxins in heating and air ducts.
Yes.
Good, very important one. The only thing that is available commercially that I know of is ERMI. We talked a lot about ERMI last time, and smart people are going to argue about ERMI. I found it to correlate very nicely with human health.
That was just the acronym police.
I was going to say, there's been a lot of those today.
They finally got out of the stop and go and pulled you over. ERMI's the Environmental Relative Moldiness Index, but we've got to keep rolling. But ERMI wouldn't tell you if there were mycotoxins or mycobacteria at this point, would it?
No way. It wouldn't tell you about actinomycetes or endotoxins or proteinases or hemolysins. It wouldn't tell you about a whole number of things.
Just a bunch, just some specific genera or species of mold.
Right, and going back to Bradford Hill, one of the things Hill makes, his comments looking at epidemiology, is that absence of knowing everything about a subject is not an excuse not to proceed based on what you can identify, and you do know. You do the best you can with what you got.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more, then we're going to the roundup for just a quick roundup. We got about 4 minutes. One of the listeners has been texting in. They want to know, and we asked earlier, but we didn't get to it. What's your opinion on the ACOEM mold statement?
Well, I have been very critical of ACOM's statement. I do not think it's based on any treatment data from people. It's based on significant speculation. It is one that our group has criticized heavily in a peer-reviewed published paper in 2006 in the neurotoxicology and teratology. It comes up every time I'm in a deposition, someone wants to quote ACOM. I really think that this is a disgrace that non-academic solutions are being imposed on people by judges and juries based on horribly flawed science. ACOM needs to retract their statement. They need to apologize for having injured so many people for so many years. And frankly, they need to pay for the damage they've done.
Well, can't be any more concise than that. Let's go to the roundup, Chris.
Move 'em on, hit 'em up, hit 'em up, move 'em on, hit 'em up, rawhide. Cut 'em out, ride 'em in, let 'em out, cut 'em out, ride 'em in, rawhide.
All right. Before we go to Rawhide, or to the roundup, I just want to make sure that our listeners know that any questions we didn't get to, please send them to me again. We'll see if we can't work something out. We've already talked to Dr. Shoemaker about possibly coming back this summer, and we'll do our best to get answers for your questions. Let's move around the table here, and we'll start with Dieter. Dr. Dieter, any questions or comments?
From what I'm hearing is that we point the finger at molds. So do I understand correctly that there are very specific biologically active compounds produced by molds, which are then most likely inhaled? I guess they could get through the skin too, but by and large inhaled, and then they do havoc to the patient, to the person. Is that the way we are kind of seeing it? Or is the mold perhaps only in a wet building, in triple quotation marks? I would expect to find a heck of a lot more than, quote, only molds. There are bacteria and, for that matter, other chemicals. Is the mold, is it very, very specific that we can find it and identify it? Or may that only be a marker to tell us this is a bad building? In this building, by and large, when the right, or for that matter, the wrong people get in there, they will have a reaction. They will show disease.
I think your question has at least three different heads to it.
Oh.
We know there are specific compounds that are found either on fungal cell walls or made and exported outside of cell walls by fungi. They cause specific inflammatory responses.
Okay.
One of the nice work that I saw just recently came out of Dr. Rand's group from Canada with his immunohistochemical and immunocytochemical detection of particular antigens from spores of Stachy being isolated in lungs and in alveolar macrophages, leading to this whole process of antigen presentation. Certainly, animals having breathed spores can show, 1,000-time amplification of pro-inflammatory cytokines following exposure. So yes, there are elements in fragments of spores and spores, as well as toxins that can cause trouble. Having said that, I think that the role of other compounds for which presence of enhanced amounts of molds indoors compared to outdoors is a marker. It means that we will find actinomycetes and bacteria and a whole host of inflammagens that I think are the far greater role. I think mycotoxins are just a drop in the bucket.
That was my hunch too, yes.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
All right. Glenn, any questions or comments?
Just a comment that, this show has been so enlightening, I think, to so many of your listeners, just watching the comments on the screen and the talk chat part of it as well. And just want to encourage Joe and Cliff to continue on with these types of topics. I think they're very, very compelling. They bring in a wider audience. I want to thank Dr. Shoemaker for being with us today. It was a great program. And let you get back to a few listener questions while you still got a minute or two.
Okay, great. Let's go to Cliff.
I've got, Joe, both a question and a comment. And I think I'll do the comment first. It really wasn't my comment, but it's really, I think, speaks to what Dr. Shoemaker is accomplishing. Actually, this is probably the nicest compliment that I think I've ever seen come up either an email or on the screen. And the comment was really that this person thought you should be nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine based on the work that you're doing. So I wanted to get that in. What my question is really deals with what I would call MCS, multi-chemical sensitivity, or mold crazies. Conventional medicine tends to think that MCS is a disease that attorneys made up. And I think they question whether or not mold-related illness really exists. I think that your position is far different than that. I guess, have you ever seen people that have come through your practice that you believe their illness is psychosomatic?
Yes, I have seen people who come here who think that they have a mold illness and say they've got a mold illness, and they've got some kind of antibody test saying that they've got a mold illness, who don't meet any element of the case definition that I have at all. So in terms of, are there people who have stress and depression that could have some of these elements present? Yes. Do stress and depression have all the elements we need? No, never. Does stress cause these inflammatory things? No, never. Does stress exist? Well, hard for me to say. I kind of think I thrive on stress. Someone else might get crushed by it. Is psychosomatic illness something that we can define medically? No, I know of no biomarker for psychosomatic illness. But having said that, a lot of times people will talk themselves into an illness, and if that is a talk and not a physiology, they won't have the blood test turn positive. You can't fake the blood test. So if you think it's psychosomatic and you're ready to dismiss the patient, do the patient the respectful thing and do the testing first. The testing is not expensive. It's readily available in all labs across the United States, and it's reproducibly reliable.
Excellent.
Excellent.
One
answer.
other question that I'm going to go with it's my turn. So I'm going with a texted question. I think it's a great one I didn't get to. The biotoxin pathway shows that in most people, biotoxins are removed from the body by the functions of the liver or the immune system. Is it possible that if a person who was exposed to an extremely high amount of biotoxins or was exposed to biotoxins over a period of several months or years can become ill, even if they have a healthy immune system?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think that question really summarizes acute and chronic illness. We know that some people will have massive point source exposures and become ill. That's kind of more of an accidental mold illness kind of thing, as in workman's comp terms. The much more common presentation is a chronic low-level exposure to a mixture of bad things, which will include some mycotoxins and all kinds of other things in a water-damaged building.
Well, that's sort of why I saved it for last. I thought it was a great way to wrap things up, and I really want to express my appreciation for you joining us. And I also want to, before we go, is there anything in particular that we forgot to ask that you'd really like to get out on this segment?
I think the most important thing is that physicians and patients need to trust the data. We can do statistical analyses of symptoms and show that symptoms really do correlate with lab abnormalities. But now that we have objective parameters, no one who feels well should not know what his baseline is, and certainly anyone who's sick should know what his baseline is. Get the data. It doesn't take much time, and it's something that is critical to how you feel next year.
All right. And one last is always your contact information, how people can get more information and or contact you or your people there.
The office phone number is in Maryland, 410-957-1550. I would suggest that people take a look at each of the three websites we have. chronicneurotoxins.com. It's been around since 2001. A newer one is biotoxin.info, and that's not .com, that's .info. It's kind of a new one to me. And then moldwarriors.com, in case someone wanted to read about looking at mold warriors. There is a new book coming out called Surviving Mold, and I sure do want you to read a copy before that goes to press, Joe and Cliff, because that's one I need to talk about. And it is, what do you do to survive after you've been found to be moldy and after you're treated? Now what?
We're looking forward to it, and I know Cliff already started on the first chapter, so or at least
right.
the the transcript on the first chapter. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shoemaker. I get that pronunciation. I like the way Glenn and Dieter pronounce it, so let me get that proper here.
You know, my mama would come after you. It's Shoemaker. Oh, there you go. Y'all have a good day now.
All right. Thank you very much.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reed saying thanks for listening.